came back to Ohio determined to make it the kind of place that I want to live. And ever since then, I have worked very hard with many of you to try to do that. And I think a key piece of that is with our transportation sector and making sure that it's a complete system that serves all Ohioans.
Excellent. And I'll pull the PowerPoint back up in just a moment, but I also wanted to introduce Eric Conley, who is a legislative aide in State Senator Tina Maharath's office. Eric, could you introduce yourself and tell me about your...
Hi, so my name is Eric. Thank you so much for having me. Honored to be a part of this panel. I've been looking forward to this all day. As you mentioned, I am the senior legislative aide for State Senator Tina Maharath. She represents the 3rd Senate District of Ohio, which includes areas around Columbus like Whitehall, Reynoldsburg, Eastern Franklin County up until Westerville, and parts of Hilltop as well. So kind of a diverse district that she represents. And I've been with her for 2 years, and part of my role is to help constituents work on policy and all of that. In terms of transportation, I'm quite passionate about issues such as public transportation, busing, making sure that our constituents can get to where they need to go. And from my own perspective, the trail system for cycling is kind of a personal passion for mine. That's how I try to get around Columbus as much as I possibly can. So the more accessibility that we have, obviously, the better. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And I thank both of you for being on this panel. It should be a really great conversation today. One of the things that has come up repeatedly in the discussions is the conversation around state funding and the role that it plays in public transportation across the state. And I know that that was a topic of intense discussion earlier in terms of where are we now, where do we want to go, and what's the best way to get there. And so before we begin our conversation today, I wanted to bring everyone up to speed in terms of the current levels of funding for public transportation at the state level, and then open it up to why is the state important, and then kind of talk about what could be some ideas in terms of where things are headed and how the state can play a role. So the first thing that we'll talk about is the schedule and important dates. For those of you who might not be familiar, the state has 2 budgets this year. One is the state transportation budget, which is going to take place during the first 3 months of this year. And that state transportation budget must be passed by the end of March and goes into effect in July. Then we have the state operating budget, which must be introduced by March 15th and has to be passed by the end of June. So this year is a big year when it comes to the future of the state, and transportation looms large in both budgets, which we'll talk about in just a minute. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of numbers is funding in the past cycle versus funding in the current cycle. This data comes from a variety of sources, including Policy Matters Ohio. So I want to salute the work that they've done on this, and Community Solutions as well. We have really tried to just understand what role public transportation plays in the current approach at the state. And looking at the previous funding cycle, there was about $33 million in federal flex dollars that went to public transit. And those could be used for capital related expenses, and $6.5 million on a line item from the general revenue fund in the state operating budget. In the last transportation budget, that number saw an increase. As you saw in the description of this event, it went up to $70 million, which was a agreement between the various chambers in terms of increasing support for the state that could be acceptable by all the parties. However, that did not include the federal flex dollars, and it was from the general revenue fund that that $70 million earmark came from. So if you heard that mentioned in previous portions of today's conference, this is where those dollars came from. So again, this PowerPoint had the state senator on there, so I want to apologize to Eric for not having his headshot on there, but I do appreciate both of you guys being here on this conversation. And so the first thing that I kind of want to understand is, where is the state now in terms of how we prioritize public transportation? I do know that there was a study not too long ago in terms of how to get the systems to a state of good repair. So Amanda, if we can kind of start with you and what you see in terms of where we're at. And then Eric, if you could follow up in terms of where you guys have played a role in approaching the conversation as it stands currently.
Sure. So the bottom line is, and I think everyone here knows this, but the state of Ohio is underinvested in public transportation for probably at least a century. And we have long been at the bottom of the pack when compared to other states in the nation. When it comes to state investments in alternative modes of transportation, including public transit. The truth is, the state of Ohio actually has a huge transportation system, one of the biggest in the country. We spend billions of dollars each year on that transportation system, but nearly all of those dollars go towards towards roads and highways and not public transit. In fact, when we started this work a little over a decade ago, we spent less than 1% of our multi-billion-dollar transportation budget on public transit. And so we have been trying very hard to increase that amount over the past decade or so. And one of the things our approaches has been, when we first came to this, transit was a line item in the general revenue fund. And at that point, it was about $6 million. This is probably maybe 12 years ago. So $6 million for about 65 transit systems across the state, compared to billions of dollars that we spend on roads and highways. This is pitiful. And at the end of the day, what it means, because we've done this for so long, nearly a century, that we have created a transportation system that is car centric. You almost have to have a car in order to get by. And as I think everyone here knows, cars are expensive. They are expensive to own. They are expensive to operate. They are expensive to maintain. They are expensive to insure. And for low-income families, they're often prohibitively expensive. For the elderly and people with disabilities, driving may not be an option at all. So at the end of the day, Ohio has created a transportation system where entire populations of people are disconnected. They are disconnected from jobs. They're disconnected from education and opportunity. They're disconnected from the grocery store, from the doctor's office. I could go on all day. And some folks think that's a civil rights issue. So that's been part of our conversation. And that's just transit. The other issues we've created with this car-centric system is that it's dangerous. It's dangerous to walk. It's dangerous to bike. And that has all kinds of repercussions, but it also means that people aren't walking and driving as much as they should be, and that basically, if you can afford to drive, if you're able to drive, you drive everywhere you need to go. And that contributes to things like the obesity epidemic, which in turn is an issue with both children and adults. And that also has implications for other health-related issues like diabetes and hypertension. So there are a lot of costs to our existing system, and to us, it's very obvious that we need to do better. And it makes, complete sense to us that we need to do better. So why has it been such an uphill battle? And the truth is there's a lot of entrenched stakeholders that are just fine with the system as it is. And so that's been an important part of the process that we have to all work together, band together, get into formation and call for what we truly need to see. And as Will alluded to in 2015, and this was one of the results of previous advocacy efforts, we secured a public transit needs assessment. And it basically said, we are way behind where we should be, and we need to be making massive investments in public transit. And at this point, that needs assessment suggested we should be funding public transit at the state level of about $150 million. That is just for transit. That doesn't even begin to talk about what should the set asides be for bicycling, safe bicycling and pedestrian infrastructure, complete streets. So that's where we're at. We made progress. We, as I mentioned, we started with a line item in the general revenue fund because public transit was treated as a health and human service. We pushed very hard for very long to get it into the transportation budget because we said it's not just a health and human service, it's a transportation alternative, and it needs to be at the big boy table when we're making decisions about what our transportation system looks like. And we have successfully done that. We are in the transportation budget now. And ever since we've gotten there, we've gone from declining revenues or investments in public transit to going uphill. In every single budget since then, we have steadily been increasing. And as Will alluded to, this last budget, we got to $70 million. At one point in the process, when the House passed its version, we hit 100 million. And that's more the kind of number we want to see. We hit sort of a glass ceiling there. It didn't stay there because there's a whole process, and we can get into that as well to better understand how the budget process works. But at the end of the day, we landed at 70 million, but it was a line item in the transportation budget. The unique piece of it that we have to understand is that it was a line item in the transportation budget, which happens before the general revenue fund, but the funds actually came out of the general revenue fund. So in essence, we essentially took 70 million off the top of the general revenue fund. Or in other words, as the debates continued about the general revenue fund, they had $70 million less to work with because that had been allocated to public transit. So it's a very unique situation. There's no other situation quite like that. But I think we want to work to keep it in the transportation budget and possibly continue that the funds come out of the general revenue fund, off the top of the general revenue fund. The highway folks and the interests, they pushed for that because they didn't want funds to be taken away from what they see as their road money. So it's a very unique place to be, and I'll just sort of stop there.
Well, thank you, Amanda. That was a wide-ranging and encompassing answer, and I appreciate that. And that's something that I think is really helpful for people just to understand how much progress has been made, which is important to acknowledge, and to salute all of the advocates, who kind of brought things to this place. And we also recognize that there is an environment in which the transportation budget lives. So Eric, if you could kind of talk about the process, Amanda alluded to it earlier, in terms of, where you guys fit in that process. And then we'll get to the environment in the next few months, which is going to be really important as well. But if you would just kind of quickly reflect the role that your office played in kind of gearing to where we are today.
Well, I would first recommend that anybody who is interested in advocating for greater support for public transportation do so, and do so early, especially within this context of the ongoing pandemic. Things have changed kind of operationally with a lot of the offices here. Everybody in the House is working remotely every day. Right now in the Senate, it's about 3 days of the week in the office and 2 remote. Meetings are happening by phone. So if you can reach out by phone, schedule meetings over Zoom like this, highly recommend that you do that. The bill should be coming to the Senate after the House. So there are layers to this, and there are steps along the way, but you want to start early. With obviously, if you're here and you're watching this, you're already at that. So thank you so much for any advocacy you can send our way to any offices. Speaking for the staff here, we're more than always happy to hear from advocates and learn more about why public transportation is so important to you personally, because those stories are very powerful.
Eric, you mentioned about where the bill originates in the House and then goes over to the Senate. And then I think the last time there was a conference committee that kind of figured out the final version. Are there committees that people should be paying attention to where the transportation budget goes, or where they may loom large in conversations about state support for public transportation?
Well, in the last GA, the bill made its way through the Transportation Committee on the Senate side. And so obviously you want to pay attention to which committee it gets onto, likely transportation again, and who sits on that committee. Committee assignments have not been determined yet for this General Assembly, and on the Senate side, I'm speaking for the Senate side. But pay attention to those assignments. You can find that on the legislature's website. See who's on the committee, and you can reach out to those offices, and then reach out to your own representative directly as well, because they might not be on the committee, but they can still, advocate on your behalf. So just pay attention. Those assignments, I believe, should be coming out relatively soon.
And Amanda, you had talked about the approach of kind of where advocates have played a role historically and to where we are now. Can you talk about the importance of advocacy, number one, and then number two, there are a lot of folks who are energized by today and are trying to think through how I can help. And I think it would be really interesting to hear your perspective as one of those leading advocates on what's been successful so far, and what people might be able to take from today's conference.
Yeah, so let me start with a few factors external to the equation that might be affecting the political deliberations for this budget. As I think most of you are aware, COVID hitting has had a number of effects, one of which is that the economic downturn that it caused and ultimately put downward pressure on tax revenues. And so there's discussions about sort of fiscal tightening of the belt. That also includes gas tax revenues. People were driving less, so there's fewer gas tax revenues, as well as general revenue funds. So that's going to be a potential downward factor in calling for lower amounts of transit funding. Another thing that I think most of you are probably aware of as people stayed home, public transit ridership went down. And that is going to be pointed out. And another reason that folks may call to reduce the amount of transit spending. Third, while the last budget allocated $70 million a year for 2 years, neither year did that entire $70 million actually make it out of the door. And particularly this past year, that is going to be another reason, folks are going to say transit funding should be reduced. So at the end of the day, while you all may set a goal for at least keeping what we got last time, which is perfectly reasonable, I believe even in that situation, a strong offense is your best defense. And we should be pushing for what we actually need, with the understanding that we might just get where we landed last time. And so that means understanding that the transit needs assessment that we talked about, which suggests we should have at least 150 million per year in revenues. And then think about, do we need set asides for pedestrian and bicycling infrastructure? Like I mentioned before, it's best if we're all on the same page, saying the same thing, calling, beating the same drum. And so in the past, the way we've accomplished that, but is by writing a letter to the governor with our ask that we collectively come up with in joint conversations. And ultimately, we get as many people across a wide geography and a wide group of organizations to sign on to that letter. So in the past, we've had folks in really every corner of the state sign on to that letter, and folks that represent like the NAACP, racial justice organizations, the various and many transit coalitions across the state. Elderly and people with disabilities have always been a critical part of our coalition. Environmental advocates. The more diverse set of folks you can get to sign on the letter, the better. And then what we've done is publish, we obviously send that letter to the governor. We CC all the political leaders in the legislature, and then share it with the press. And we've had it published in press outlets in its entirety. When we first started coming to the Transportation Committee, instead of the General Revenue Fund, they told us we were in the wrong place. We don't do public transit here. And they don't tell us that anymore. They expect us. So we want to make sure we're there and fulfill that expectation. And there's multiple places. So that's just the start. You start getting everybody on the same page. You tell the governor what you want. The governor will put out his executive proposal probably late January, early February. So you'd want to get that letter to him before that happens. The governor submits that letter to the House of Representatives, submits his proposed budget for transportation to the House of Representatives. That's a press opportunity. You want to establish yourself as the resource to the press, and all over the state and in your local jurisdiction, by putting out press statements reacting. So you'll want to react to the governor's version of the budget. You'll want to react to what the House comes up with. You'll want to react to what the Senate comes up with. And you'll want to react to what the conference committee comes up with. Because the House and the Senate version won't be the same. And so the final opportunity is try to get what you want in the conference committee, and then it goes to the governor to sign, and there's some limited opportunity there. So that's, yeah.
I appreciate that. And Eric, if you would just kind of follow up, I think especially to Amanda's point about the fiscal environment that we find ourselves in, I think that's going to be a really important question of what will resonate in this environment with elected officials who, many people are not traveling perhaps as much, but the need for accessibility is just as great. Could you kind of talk about that?
Right. Well, the need for accessibility is just as great. And I think one of the groups that we didn't mention, I think, earlier were seniors. You know, I think a lot of us have family members who are older who, you know, just aren't able to drive or don't want to drive anymore. And but you know, because of the way we live, you're kind of stranded out in the middle of nowhere. So how do you get access to food and the most basic necessities? I think it's a need anyway, even outside of the pandemic. And then with the pandemic, we're isolated, especially our older family members. And so just accessibility in general is a major issue right now. But you know, I hear the point about limited revenues because of, you know, fewer people driving or out on the roads as it is anyway. So you know, it's a crucial issue, and I think that this pandemic is going to be hovering over everything that everybody does this year.
I see our conference chair has stepped on, so I do want to yield to her before I ask my next question. But go ahead, Angie.
Well, I was just going to say we want to try and wrap this up, and then I have some instructions for this next section.
Okay. All right. Well, real quick, this will be a question to both of you. We'll start with Eric, and then we'll close with Amanda. This question is about messaging. How important, Eric, is it to have a united message or a consistent message when you are communicating with your legislators? I think that's something that I have always had a question about in advocacy. When you have a diverse group, is how do you reach through to the legislators in a way that will resonate with them? So could you talk about that?
Well, I would say, just in my experience, as I mentioned, personal stories are powerful. Personal stories can be diverse and different, and if you've got a lot of different voices coming at once, exactly, it becomes disparate and probably not as powerful or as it could be if it was more unified. So finding a way to connect with others, to share your personal motivation, which might be very unique. You might have had a situation, or you might have had an issue with access yourself or a family member, and then share that with others in a way that you can kind of streamline that communication into your advocacy, I would say. And again, this is a unique perspective, a unique environment in which to be advocating. But in many ways, it's changed for the better. You know, we're used to Zoom, we're used to doing this online meeting and communications now. That is a plus for accessibility, I would say. And so there are positives to it as well. But no, it's absolutely crucial to, if you can, bring together unique and disparate voices into one unified message. Absolutely.
Great. And then Amanda, if you could just kind of close us out. You got 80 people on here who are interested in this topic. And I think having our shared experiences in a way that will resonate, we're very much interested in hearing from you on that topic about messaging in an effective manner. And then I'll yield to Angie for the call to action.
I think two things I want to say is one, we will never have the kind of money that highway contractors and other big players have. What we have is power in numbers and the ability to make a lot of noise. And we have to do that together. We have to be beating from the same drum. And so we must network and continue our conversation together. And two, the second thing I want to say is the most powerful thing that I ever did as an advocate is when I tag teamed in public testimony for the transportation budget with a woman by the name of Donna Priest. She is a person in a wheelchair who is, you know, entirely dependent on being able to access public transit to get where she needs to go, to be able to work, to be able to have a life. She started her with, you know, when we tag team, she went first, and I literally could see the hearts and minds of the legislators open. I watched them go from being braced and, you know, tight to, I get it. I didn't really understand this before. Now I get it. But she can't just go alone, because you have to be able to say, this is not just an issue for Donna. This is bigger. This is a systemic problem that affects many, many, many more people like Donna and others. And so I think that's where the bigger the data and the bigger issues come into play, because otherwise you just, you know, people just want to give $50 to Donna, and that's not going to solve our problem.
Well, I appreciate both you guys' perspective. In this conference, we heard about the importance of public transportation and both the urban, suburban, and rural areas. And I think messaging that in a way that's effective at the state level is just as important as it has ever been. So I want to thank both of you for your insight and your perspective. And I'm going to yield to our conference chair, Angie, for the call to action. Thank you.